If you've been a part of a church for a while, you may have heard somebody say, we're blessed to be a blessing. And that's kind of the bumper sticker approach to God's mission. We are blessed by being made in the image of God. And our call is to bless others in God's name. But we keep seeing that mission sidetracked by humans' pride and selfishness. We're going to witness another beginning in Genesis when God chooses Abraham and Sarah to take up that mission again. If they are obedient to God, if they respond to Him faithfully, then He promises to bless them with a land of their own, with descendants so numerous they would be like the stars and couldn't be counted, and with the reputation of having an influence around the whole world. And as they travel on with God, they are faithful to that mission. It's clear from the very beginning that blessing and responsibility walk side by side on this journey of faith. Believe it or not, if Jesus were to participate in Ancestry.com, it would trace his lineage all the way back to Abraham and Sarah. And that's really what Matthew is doing in the beginning of his gospel. It's a long list for us, and sometimes we find those genealogies so tedious. But Matthew is doing so much more than tracing fathers, sons, and mothers through one generation after the next. No, much more importantly, he is tracing God's faithfulness from one generation to the next until we read the name Jesus of Nazareth. At this point, we will witness God's fullest, best expression of love for all of His creation.
So far we've heard Jesus' announcement of the good news of the kingdom, and then we've gone back to the beginning of the scriptures to see how we get to Jesus' announcement of the kingdom. So we started at the cross, or we started at Jesus' announcement of the kingdom, and we went back to Genesis. And in Genesis, in the first 2 chapters, we saw and talked about creation, the world the way that God intended for it to be, a perfect world. And then in Genesis 3 to 11, we saw the problem that the scriptures deal with, which is the problem of human sin and brokenness, and also the brokenness of creation itself. So this is the problem. And so at the end of this section, the question is, what's God going to do now? God has been pursuing humanity. God's been working to reach out to lost people. We came looking for Adam and Eve, but nothing seems to work. And so by the end of Genesis chapter 11, here's the issue. God continues to reach out to work to redeem people, but people keep going their own way. And so now humanity's scattered. So what's God going to do? Well, God doesn't flood the earth again. That was settled in Noah's Ark, and God had promised to never do that again. So what are God's options at this point? Well, God's option is to begin to launch the movement that's going to reach its climax with the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, and then Jesus sending the church out to share that good news. And it starts in a parallel way, really, to how Jesus starts. Jesus started his ministry by announcing the kingdom and calling a community to himself. Well, when we get through the scriptures, again, the first 11 chapters of the Bible aren't really about Israel. They're about everybody. But we know that the Old Testament's about God's people, Israel, the Jews. But Israel's scriptures start, as we've talked, about with the whole world in view. Every person who's ever lived is here. Well, it's at this point in Genesis chapter 12 that God begins a new part of the story, and this is going to be the story of Israel. And Israel's story essentially goes from Genesis chapter 12 and slowly moves towards its climax in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, Israel's Messiah, Israel's Christ. And it starts in Genesis chapter 12 with God creating a new humanity that's going to serve as God's hands, God's feet, and God's mouthpieces. So the rest of the book of Genesis is going to focus on the beginning of the people that are going to become Israel. And Israel's ancestors have the names of Abraham and Sarah. They have, their promises are passed on then to Isaac and Rebekah. And then Isaac and Rebekah take the promise to the next generation, and Jacob is going to have 12 sons, and Jacob's 12 sons will become the names of the 12 tribes of Israel who will be God's people, Israel, for the Old Testament. So Genesis is a book of beginnings that introduces us to and sets the stage for the next big piece of the biblical story, which is going to be the Exodus. But let's pause and talk about what's the role of Genesis 12 through 50 in the Scriptures. Now, notice how I drew this diagram. I've had it open-ended. This open-ended part was because this is a universal story. This is all people everywhere. And so the Bible starts off with the whole in view. Now, I also want to say that once we get past Jesus' resurrection, the biblical story is going to open back up to the whole world again. But now, with the story of Israel, the biblical story essentially, we might just say it flatlines, and it moves from focusing on everyone to simply focusing on God's solution, which is going to be a new missional community through whom God is going to bless the nations. And so these initial stories introduce us to Israel's ancestors, and this is going to be a key piece for reading the Old Testament. The Old Testament isn't the story of how God is for Israel against everyone else. The story of Israel is how God is for Israel for the sake of blessing ultimately all the other nations. Now, when God calls Abraham, it's important to recognize where that falls in history, because people have been on the planet for a long time. And a lot of times when we read the Bible, we don't recognize how late in the game Abraham comes along. By the time that God calls Abraham, and roughly Abraham as a historical figure would have fallen into what's known as the Middle Bronze period of the ancient Near East, and that's roughly 2000 to 1800 BC. So about 2,000 years before Jesus is born, God's going to call Abraham. Before Abraham's born, the pyramids were already built. There's people all over the planet. There's sophisticated civilizations in Egypt. There's sophisticated civilizations in Babylon. People like the Sumerians would have lived. And then there's people all over the planet, on all of the continents of the earth. People have already moved in building civilizations. So it's at this point that there's people all over the world, and at this point God enters into human history again and begins this movement that's going to ultimately culminate in Jesus' coming. He calls Abraham. And Abraham's call comes in Genesis chapter 12, and the first three verses are three of the most important scriptures that we have, and they give us the proper framework for reading the rest of the Old Testament. As I have already said, in the Old Testament, God isn't for Israel against other people. God is for Israel for the sake of other people. And here's what I mean by that. When God calls Abraham, this is in the days when it wasn't safe to travel. God is going to call Abraham to a bold and daring adventure. It says, "The Lord said to Abraham, 'Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and so I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curses you I will curse. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed.'" So what's Abraham's calling? God calls Abraham out of the known world into the unknown world. If you recall, when we talked about Jesus, where Jesus began his ministry, Jesus didn't begin his ministry at the center of Jewish religious power and prestige. Jesus was up in the Galilee. In the same way, when God begins his mission that's going to ultimately redeem the world, God calls Abraham from traditional power centers. Abraham would have been from the area of Babylon, which would be in the southern Iraq of today, and calls Abraham to make this journey and to move into a new land. So he moves from the old to the new. He moves from the known to the unknown. And Abraham becomes a new community. And so God creates, you might even say, a new humanity in this new place in the land of Canaan, which is going to be the promised land in the Bible. So this small patch of earth, and this whole area is about the size of New Jersey in the United States. It's in this place becomes the epicenter for God's mission in preparation for Jesus' coming. And the key thing are the promises that God makes to Abraham. And notice he promises him protection, but embedded in this, and this is central, is a mission. Abraham's role is God is going to bless him so that he can be a blessing. And so the whole call of Abraham, and in fact the call of Israel, as we'll see throughout this study, is that God calls Abraham to be a blessing to what? All families on the earth. And so these early stories, the calling of Abraham, sets us into this paradigm in which we can see that Israel exists not for itself, but Israel exists as God's missional people that exist for the sake of all nations on the earth. And when we understand that, we can read the rest of the Old Testament with real understanding. So the beginning of the gospel involves God's calling of Abraham to move from the old world to the new world with his family. He doesn't go alone. This isn't a story of the Lone Ranger going off for adventure. This isn't the story of a lone Christian. We've already seen that community is a central part of Scripture, and it's no different in Genesis. When God calls Abram or Abraham, he's also calling Abraham's wife Sarah, and with them comes a large block of people. So it's a whole community that shifts. And so when God calls Abraham to this mission, it's not just an individual mission, it's a missional community. And God also calls Abraham to holiness. When we get to Genesis chapter 17, God says things like this to Abram: walk before me and be blameless. Now, what's important when we read through the Genesis stories, there's a difference between Genesis 12 to 50 and Genesis 1 to 11. In Genesis 1 to 11, what was the problem? People kept making spectacularly bad choices. Well, when you read the stories of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, of all their descendants, what we find is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob still make really bad decisions. Like when you read through these stories, Abraham and Isaac will deny that they're married and say that their wife is their sister. That leads to all kinds of problems. We'll find out that Jacob is oftentimes a cheater for a big block of his life. But guess what? These stories are about how God is going to move God's mission forward. So the emphasis isn't so much on the character and the model that these Israel's ancestors set, but it's on God's faithfulness to the promises that He's made. And so God makes promises to Abraham, they're passed on to Isaac and passed on to Jacob, that they're going to be the means of blessing the earth. There's going to be promises of children. There's going to be promises of this land. And so these are all about promises in God's faithfulness to His promise. Now, one of the most significant verses in all of this is Genesis chapter 12, verse 4. And it's subtle because we've already had these great verses about mission, but Genesis 12:4 reports something really important. It says this: Abraham went. And so there's a lesson for us. We don't know. Abraham comes around 2000 BC. We don't know if God had called other persons up to this point, but here's what we do know. When Abraham heard God's call, Abraham responded, he took action, and he goes. And this launches the movement that's going to be the gospel. We're also introduced to an important concept in these stories of Abraham, and that's going to be the word covenant. And covenant's an ancient word that comes out of the Near East. And what it is it's a relational word, and it's used to make legal contracts regarding relationships. The first covenant that we actually saw was back with Noah. God made a covenant with Noah after the flood that God would never again flood the earth. The second covenant that we're going to see is with Abraham, and this is in chapter 17. And this is a significant covenant because God gives Abraham the unconditional promise that Abraham will always have children that come after him. He will always have descendants to carry on this mission. And the sign of this covenant is going to be the sign of circumcision, where Israelite males are going to be marked in a distinctive way to show that they're fully God. And what this introduces us to is a concept that we'll see throughout the Scriptures, is the concept of how to initiate people into community, or the process of initiation. When we get to the New Testament, what was started with Abraham is going to continue on. It's going to be called baptism. We become part of God's missional community by being initiated into that community, either as children or as adults who come into it. So Genesis 12 to 50, the emphasis is on God's faithfulness to His promises, and we see God's desire to perpetuate these promises through the line of Abraham going on to Isaac, Jacob, and onward to create this missional community through whom God is ultimately going to bless the nations through Jesus. When we read the stories in Genesis, there's a couple of issues that sometimes take us by surprise. As I've mentioned, as God reveals Himself in Genesis 12 to 50, is a God of promises. He's a God who moves things forward by His promises and His grace. And essentially, these chapters exist to demonstrate that God can be trusted. We can't trust ourselves because we continue to make bad choices, but we can trust God. And there's two ways that God works against the ancient culture to really demonstrate that these stories are about God guiding the gospel forward and not simply about human ingenuity, power, and talent as the way to advance the gospel. And what I mean by this there's two themes that we've encountered already. One of those is the theme that the firstborn son is ultimately supplanted by the second-born or a younger son. So, for example, in this Cain and Abel story, Abel, the youngest son, his sacrifice is preferred over the elder son. That's very much subversive of a cultural norm in the ancient world because times were hard, and we still see some vestiges of this practice even into the 21st century. Is typically in ancient families, the firstborn son was privileged. And it was privileged because resources were scarce. So if you wanted to see your family succeed for the long haul, you would put all your resources onto your best chance. And it was in culture that tended to be the firstborn son. And so when God's advancing His gospel, if God just uses firstborn sons, that would be exactly who the audience of those days would expect God to use. But instead, God reverses that. So we see Abel, his sacrifice is chosen over Cain. In the Abraham story, the firstborn son of Abraham is Ishmael, but he's not the promised son. The promised son is the son that comes through God's power. That's going to be Isaac. Jacob and Esau. Jacob's the second born to Esau, yet the promises go forward in Jacob, and we'll continue to see this move through the Scriptures in the same way. So that's one thing. The second theme that we see that God uses to subvert cultural norms and to show that the gospel advances through God's power is through God's work in the lives of couples who aren't able to have children, the problem of childlessness. So when we first meet Abraham, for example, Abraham and his wife Sarah are already well advanced in age, and they have no children. Yet God calls them. Why would God call the old and the childless over a young family? It's because God can demonstrate God's power better through Abraham and Sarah than He could have used through a younger couple that had many children already. And so this theme of childlessness, God uses it to teach that the gospel advances through His power and not through human power. And so when we read through the biblical narrative, the hero often is born to a couple that hasn't been able to have children previously. So Abraham and Sarah, they have Isaac, the promised child, out of their union. Isaac and Rebekah, after not being able to have children, are blessed with twins, Esau and Jacob. When we get into the rest of the Scriptures, Samson is born to a childless couple. Samuel is born to a childless couple. And then even when we get to Jesus, Jesus is actually born to a woman who doesn't even have a husband. And so God is going to advance his kingdom, advance the gospel, not through typical channels of power, but in ways that illustrate God's power, that God's ultimately in control. So sometimes we struggle with the issue of the firstborn being supplanted, or even with the issue of childlessness. But God is able to use these two things to say that I got everything under control, and you're saved by my grace, and you don't have to rely on yourself to get yourselves out of trouble. You may be wondering how these stories in Genesis connect back to the New Testament. We started with Jesus' announcement of the kingdom, and then we moved back to talk about creation. And creation gave us a picture of humanity the way that God intended for it to be, that we were to be a missional people, a community that reflects God's character. So when Jesus comes on the scene, Jesus, in essence, comes to demonstrate what it truly means to be human. So in the Gospel of John, for example, John's Gospel in the first chapter begins with verses that sound very much like Genesis. So John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And then it goes on to talk about how the Word, Jesus, takes on humanity and dwells among us. And at the end of chapter 1, it has a really interesting verse. It says of Jesus in John chapter 1, it says, "No one has ever seen God. It is God, the only Son, who's close to the Father's heart, who has made him known." Now think about Genesis. Think about why we were created. We were created to point others to God. When Jesus comes, Jesus, the Son of God, comes into our world to live the truly human life. And by doing so, according to verse 18, he makes the Father known. And so Jesus points to a way back to our own humanity by beginning to follow after him. When we look at the fall narratives, the Apostle Paul can look back on the story of Adam and Eve, and in that episode, Paul sees two options. Everyone who follows after the ways of Adam, who trusts self, ends up being lost. But then Paul says, look at Jesus, this new human, the new Adam, in chapter 5 of Romans, and says, through Jesus, we can undo the effects of what Adam done. And so in Jesus isn't death, but instead it's life and salvation and reconciliation. So the New Testament consciously uses Jesus' life, death, and resurrection as the climax or the fullest fulfillment and reversal of these stories that we see in Genesis. Now, what about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? How do they fit into the New Testament? Well, as I said, the key part of understanding Israel is to see Israel in connection with the nations. And so in the book of Galatians and also in the Gospel of Matthew, we find references to Abraham that remind us of the mission of what God wants to do. So when we begin the New Testament, the first thing that we're going to find is a genealogy. And in Matthew's Gospel, it says the genealogy of Jesus, the son of Abraham. So why is it important for us to know that Jesus is the son of Abraham? It's because in Abraham, Abraham is the connection of God's people to all the nations that God has created. So when we're introduced to Jesus, the first thing we know about Jesus is that Jesus is going to be the fullest fulfillment of Abraham. He's going to be the one through whom all the nations are blessed. Then when we get to Galatians and also Romans 4, Paul is going to look back to Abraham. And we've already mentioned Abraham got all these promises from God. And what did Abraham do? Abraham took action. He trusted God's promises and he followed after God. And so Paul is going to look back on Abraham and on Abraham's actions. And Paul is going to see in Abraham a model for the gospel. Because what does Abraham do? Abraham models for us deep trust or faith. And one of the Apostle Paul's favorite verses from the Old Testament is Genesis chapter 15, verse 6. And in a couple of contexts, in Romans chapter 4 and in Galatians 3, Paul is going to point back to Abraham as a model for faith and what it looks like to follow after God. And he's going to quote Genesis 15, 6, which was, Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And so how is it that Abraham is ultimately able to fulfill this idea that he's blessed to be a blessing? It's going to be through faith. And what is it faith in? It's not faith in Abraham's own abilities. It's going to be faith in the God who's called him, who has humanity in his heart, and who desires to bless all the nations.